Hi, everyone, and welcome as we come together for the first entirely online ISOJ. We're excited to have you here. I'm Mallory Tenori, Associate Director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas at the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes with you. I want to let you know that all of the panels, all the keynotes, and the workshops will be interpreted to Spanish. So if you'd like to join and watch in Spanish, click Interpretation in the meeting options below and select the Spanish channel. I should also mention that we are live streaming on YouTube in English and in Spanish. So you can tune into the live stream at any point if you have any technical issues here on Zoom. And we'll be posting links to those YouTube channels in the Zoom chat. Now, if you do have any technical issues, you can please feel free to contact our tech helpline via WhatsApp or text, and that number is 817-526-0179. Again, 817-526-0179. Lastly, please remember to follow and use the hashtag ISOJ2020 to stay connected with the conference on social media. And we encourage you to share questions in the chat feature of Zoom, and we'll do our best to address those at the end of the conversation. So with that said, I would like to introduce this amazing conversation we're about to have about covering electoral campaigns in the digital age, with a focus on the presidential elections in the US in 2020. So we'll hear from Evan Smith of the Texas Tribune, Laura Barrón-López of Politico, Katie Glueck of the New York Times, Alexi McCammond of Axios, and Dave Weigel from the Washington Post. So without further ado, I would now like to turn it over to Evan Smith.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, or whatever time it is where you're watching this. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Good to be with you. As Mallory said, I'm Evan Smith. I'm the CEO of the Texas Tribune. Welcome. I'm so pleased to be participating in ISOJ once again. Thanks for asking, always, Rosendahl. In a moment, I'll be leading a discussion, as Mallory said, about covering the 2020 campaign with 4 of my favorite political reporters. We'll be talking for about 55 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. But before we begin, a little context by way of setup. This is the weirdest effing campaign ever. To paraphrase the president at his press conference, tropiest, no one's seen anything like it before. It's weird for candidates generally, as their attempts to get airtime are necessarily being thwarted in a momentous election year by three once-in-a-generation crises playing out at the same moment: public health emergency, economic collapse, reckoning over race. It's weird for incumbents specifically because regardless of their role or responsibility, as office holders at all levels, they're the ones on the hook for a response when in most places things haven't gone well. It's weird for challengers specifically because so much for their best laid plans, organizing and door knocking and GOTV, anything conventional, hatched in the before as ground game and strategy and tactics. It's weird for voters who don't get to meet and rarely get to hear from the candidates they're being asked to choose among. And in the absence of expanded mail-in voting, cough, cough, Texas, cough, cough, have been forced to literally put their lives on the line to cast a ballot. And it's weird for the press, who must cover a fire hose of news, even as they're severely constrained in many ways in their ability to do their jobs. But do them they must. The future of our democracy rides on it. Our session today addresses that last point, how weird it is for the press at the moment, and what it's like to be on the campaign trail virtual during all of this. We are joined, as you heard, by four next-gen pros. Laura Barrón-López, national political reporter for Politico. Katie Glueck, national politics reporter at the New York Times. Alexi McCammond, politics reporter at Axios. And finally, Dave Weigel, national political correspondent for the Washington Post and author of The Trailer, the Washington Post's thrice weekly newsletter about the campaign. Good to be with all of you guys. Sorry not to be with you in person. Hopefully that'll happen at some point in our lifetimes soon.
Thanks for having us, Evan.
Good to see you guys. Katie Glueck, let me start with you. Obviously, this is not the campaign you thought you were going to cover. How have you adjusted to the change? Give us a real personal sense of what you thought it was going to be like and what it's actually been like.
Well, thanks, Evan. Great to be here. Great to be here with all of you, even virtually. My experience as a Biden campaign beat reporter was that we were sort of on the go on Super Tuesday, and we had been on a really intense swing in a couple of the days leading up to Super Tuesday, from Alabama to Virginia to Texas to California. And then we came back after that to Super Tuesday. Then there was a little bit more campaigning in places like Michigan, and then everything just came to a stop. And so I think you used a good term. It's weird. It's weird for all the different constituencies that you mentioned, and perhaps as well for the candidate who has been seeking to adjust for quite a big part of this quarantine by campaigning from home, and now is slowly trying to get back out there about once a week so far to be a little bit more in public, and the press is of course trying to figure out how do you cover that, how do you cover more broadly what's happening in the country when there are so many logistical considerations and health considerations as well.
I think maybe we lost Evan. If he's gone, I can pick up from there. I think it's been a really weird personal experience, Katie, to your point, because of how much we were traveling and how that became our new norm. And I feel like we just all kind of got...
Alexi, it's easy to think that we've been at this work from home thing and nobody traveling and everything disrupted for...
Oh, I think we lost him again. Alexi.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to join in on this train talking about it personally again, because we traveled so much in the beginning, and I feel like none of us were even, I can only speak for myself, we're thinking about just that experience of literally living out of a suitcase. I mean, I know I saw all of you on the road all the time, and you're going nonstop, always thinking about the next place you're going to go. I would think about, okay, I have one night in my apartment in DC, maybe 2 nights, and that felt like a luxury. And then it's so weird to go from that to the opposite, the extreme end of the scale, where we're stuck at home trying to figure out not just how we build sources, which is a unique experience when everything is virtual, when you can't meet people face to face, but talking to voters, which is something that I loved doing, that I felt like helped my analysis, whether it was in writing or on TV, because you got a real sense of how people actually felt, which helps me better understand the polls and the numbers and sort of like the hypotheticals that we were talking about, especially with things that consume DC, that then you get out there and it's kind of like nobody's actually talking about this, or if they are talking about it, they're talking about it differently than maybe we were or we heard in DC. So I really miss doing that. But luckily, one thing that we're doing, we did those Obama-Trump focus groups throughout the upper Midwest. Now those are all virtual on Zoom. So like I still get to hear from voters that way, but obviously it's so different than getting to talk to them at a rally or a campaign stop. So
yeah, well, technology doesn't always work. Yeah, technology doesn't always work, but where it does work, you can possibly substitute it for the real thing. Let me ask Laura Barrón-López the same thing. What were you expecting from this campaign, and how has the change actually affected the work that you do in the broadest sense?
Right. I mean, like Katie and Alexi, I was on the road nonstop from January until the first quarantine started to hit, which was about the first few weeks of March. So it was definitely whiplash, a hard adjustment. And I also kind of took up a second beat. So I cover race, ethnicity, demographics, you know, on the election trail, covered
Right.
Black voters, Latino voters. And I very much miss those interactions with voters. But I also have now expanded my beat a bit to cover coronavirus and the disproportionate impact of coronavirus on Black, Latino, Native American population. So that's been a bit of an adjustment for me, is also bringing in a bit of a new beat for myself. And I've enjoyed it. It's an important story to be covering. But at the same time, I'm still covering the Black Lives Matter movements. And unfortunately, we're just not able to do the same type of reporting that we typically would be able to. It's, you know, flying on planes or going to these events the way we would like to.
Laura, have you been traveling really at all over the last couple? Are you doing this entirely remotely, or are you able to travel at all in these last couple of months?
I haven't been traveling at all. We have sent, you know, a few reporters here and there to one reporter, you know, per event, to either the Biden rally that was held in Oklahoma, or the the Trump rally that was held in Oklahoma.
Right. Yeah.
Or Biden events in Pennsylvania. But again, it's only one reporter going to these so few events. I would like to, in the coming months, hopefully get out there on the road to talk to some voters, probably just to places that I can drive to. I don't think I feel comfortable getting on a plane just yet.
Yeah. Before I go to Dave Weigel, Alexi and Katie, very quickly, have either of you really left your homes that much over the last couple of months? How much travel have you been in? Alexi first, and then Katie.
I haven't traveled at all, just like Laura. I think I'm going to Milwaukee for the convention, and that'll be the first time I'm traveling for work.
Right. Katie, how much work have you done outside of your place on the Biden campaign trail in the last couple of months?
I actually have started slowly to travel. I did go to President Trump's rally in Tulsa. I didn't go in, a colleague of mine did, but I was there sort of on the ground, standing outside, trying to talk to voters and attendees there. And I actually got back the week before last from doing a campaign reporting trip in the suburbs of Charlotte. So it was my first time flying since March, definitely an adventure, but
those are the exceptions though, right? That's the exception. Mostly you're just basically sheltering in place.
We are, I think, some of us, I think, hoping to start moving to getting out there a little bit more. But yes, absolutely, the default is to quarantine, you know, like the rest of the country.
Yeah. Weigel, this is meant to be a compliment to you. I read the trailer every time it comes out, and I really can't tell whether you're frozen in place or whether you're traveling. You've done a pretty good job of faking somebody who's operating as a regular political reporter in your newsletter.
Well, I've traveled a bit. Like Katie, I went to the Tulsa rally. I've been on a few planes. I went to Ohio for their primary because that was the first state that, you know, kind of restarted the machine after the pandemic. I went to Texas to cover the Texas Democrats convention, actually, which, Evan, as you just saw, the Republicans holding theirs. The Democrats are trying to prove if you have enough prep and you admit in advance you're not going to get a huge crowd there, that you can scale it down but get your message out, raise money. And I went to New York and back for the primaries that, as we are meeting here, are still not finished counting, and it was a month since I went up there, literally a month since voters in New York turned their ballots in. So I've done a little bit, and what I've been missing is some of the gut check you get from just leaving the internet to go talk to people, and it was very helpful. I wouldn't say that I saw every twist in the 2020 race coming, but you didn't find yourself getting wrapped up in the same Twitter narratives or the same kind of circle of thinking that people might all have if they're all following the campaign very closely. I mean, a thing I always liked is beyond talking to voters at the rallies, seeing what was penetrating, what was on local news, what was in the local paper, and you don't get the same thing. So I try to simulate that. Frankly, a lot with phone calls, but a lot was just checking out what local news is focused on, talking to county party chairs. But I am missing the random interactions with voters that I think are, as unscientific as they are super helpful. So I've had to find other ways to convey the totality of the campaign that don't involve, meeting people in public. I mean, you're seeing that now with people trying to gather petition signatures or register people to vote. One story I'd probably be writing right now is about the Democrats' ground game, the Republican ground game. Democrats' ground game at the moment, even in primaries, is mostly phone calls, voter contacts, but nothing door to door. So it's changed everything.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to that question of the ground game, but let me stay, Dave, for a second with the voters. I mean, the problem is sort of two ways. One is that reporters aren't really going on the road by and large. We've heard about a couple of exceptions here, but that's really the exception to this. But the second thing is voters aren't particularly interested in being in those mass gatherings either. A couple of people referenced the Trump rally in Tulsa. Mm-hmm. Voters don't want to be with you right now or politicians any more than you want to be really with them. I mean, you might like to in the ideal sense, but this is not really a moment for you all to be together, right? So you're going to have to improvise.
I think so, and I think that was a signal that some people, no one on this call, but I think some people missed in speculating on the Republican side, speculating that the president was going to crowd Joe Biden out of the news. He was going to have a rally and prove how his base is still active and out there, and Biden's isn't. And it was pretty much a debacle. I mean, a debacle that led to the demotion of Trump's campaign manager because, people are not super comfortable going out there. It really, I'm 38, and I don't think anyone in this call is in their hundreds, but you really haven't seen this level of campaign where somebody's just not out there stumping for the vote, where they're just getting the message out on their own schedule once a week. I don't know, right. Arguably 1952. Maybe you have to go back earlier than that. But accepting that reality that just people are not going to be going to political events, and how do they operate? I had to do that early on. It's been helpful because people have been voting. You saw that again in Texas, not to just keep pandering to Texas, but you saw huge runoff turnout from people mailing in their absentee ballots and doing a little bit in person. By far the highest turnout in a run for Texas Democrats in runoff history. And that was not from candidates going to diners to meet them. That was people kind of self-teaching and the parties doing this very quiet behind the scenes outreach.
And can I pick up on something he said,
Please.
Evan? So I think Dave's point is interesting. We look at how President Trump is kind of like not forcing, but enticing people to come out in public at a time when we aren't really certain about the direction in which coronavirus is moving and all the facts behind that and how to keep yourself safe. And we saw that people weren't really comfortable coming out in large numbers that they expected. And then on the flip side, you see Biden, to Dave's point about this idea between Trump crowding him out and Biden staying home, Biden and his campaign really trying to just meet voters where they are online, which in some ways feels like the most basic concept when we all pre-coronavirus were talking about digital tools that campaigns were using and digital strategies and how important that was. Now it seems like the most basic rudimentary thing for a campaign to be doing, but it's something that's helping Biden. And, the interesting thing too about trying to figure out how to think about how voters are feeling in this moment when you're not meeting them in person. I find myself looking a lot at like the Q&A section on Zooms when the campaign holds Zoom meetings to see what kind of questions and themes are emerging in the things that voters are concerned about that they're asking about. What do the poll report questions say? It's really about those questions that people are asking, less so even than what Biden is saying half the time, because he's not always making that much news. It's really about like, what are people asking that can signal to us what they care about? Is it all about VP or is it about immigration and healthcare?
Yeah. Katie, when you were outside the Trump rally in Tulsa, you said you talked to voters. You were one of the Times reporters who made the trip. Did you find that voters were receptive to talking to you? And was it a different experience of talking to voters than you're used to pre-pandemic?
Certainly, it did feel very different compared to pre-pandemic. There were a lot of, this was in June, there were a lot of there's sort of a divergence of viewpoints around whether or not to wear a mask. That was, of course, a big flashpoint surrounding the rally more broadly. I mean, there were a lot of people in line who were not wearing masks. I was wearing a mask. I think, Dave, I saw you there. I know that you were as well. So sort of navigating how it was my first experience being out there trying to interview people while I was wearing a mask. Many of those folks were not wearing masks. So, that did add just a new layer of, something I hadn't experienced before. When I was in the suburbs of Charlotte a couple of weeks ago, I was trying to interview voters in grocery store parking lots. A lot of voters there were wearing masks and were sort of especially attuned, just because it was such a hot spot in terms of the coronavirus, were especially attuned to the dynamics surrounding the pandemic, whereas a lot of the voters who chose to come to the event in Tulsa were not so motivated by those concerns around the virus. And that was part of why those who did show up were kind of willing to go into that big arena where there had been a lot of concerns that could be a super spreader event. So certainly injected all kinds of new dynamics in terms of talking to people in a pandemic. And it was a reminder of how different people of, different parts of the country are feeling it, and the degree of urgency there is certainly different.
Yeah. Laura, Alexi referenced the Q&A sections of these Zoom appearances or trying to basically fill in what would otherwise be in-person contact with voters with something that you access online. Really, you have a void that's been created by the lack of all this activity, haven't you? You really can't see candidates, you really can't see voters, but you've still got to report. I just wonder strategically, what has that meant for you? How do you put the narrative together? How do you figure out what the narrative is in an environment like that?
I guess just leaning on all of my sources constantly, which is not that much different than what I would do, I guess, pre-COVID, but constantly having as many conversations as possible, especially with like grassroots organizers or people that can put a check on the DC bubble. Other pollsters that are trying to keep a pulse on different electorates. So, people who focus on polling Latinos and those who focus on polling Black voters, and just making sure that I'm getting as big of a picture as possible. Also, like Alexi, I definitely do pay attention to the Q&A section of Zooms, not just Biden's, but also Zoom panels held by other electeds, Zoom panels held by, the BLM movement, all of those, to try to really just see what people are asking about. And I think, one of the issues that a campaign like Biden is having is, one, like his campaign even criticized the lack of coverage that they were getting just on cable news. So like the inability to have some of his speeches or some of his virtual comments just make it out there into the public domain beyond what they're pushing out themselves. And that, I think, is because so much of the public focus right now is on COVID, is on being able to make that next paycheck. We have the relief running out at the end of this month. There could be mass evictions.
Right.
I think there's so many things occupying the brains of the voter right now that is making it not just difficult for Biden, but also difficult for Trump to break through in the way that he would like to.
Right. Dave, you talked about Twitter and spending a lot of time on Twitter and the value of not spending time on Twitter. It occurs to me that in the absence of a lot of the traditional reporting channels, that media becomes that much more important as both a gathering place for this conversation and also a source. Mm-hmm. But as we know, social media is frequently, in cases like this, weaponized to spread disinformation and misinformation. And that has been a particular problem, it seems to me, in this campaign. And that's before we even get to Bitcoin scams, right?
Yeah.
How do you factor that in, or how do you account for that? How do you account for the disproportionate role that social media plays when everything else has basically been leveled to nothing? With in particular the misinformation problem.
Yeah, I can't say that I've mastered it really. I do a lot of searches on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, on the things the best known, a little bit of Nextdoor occasionally. That's not super fruitful. And I think when I did the most of this was when there were a few protests that kind of blossomed for a couple of weeks and then faded by people demanding states and their restrictions around COVID, these reopen protests. And I mostly reported that by seeing how much stuff was trending, looking at, doing a search on Twitter for media, because often people upload their photos, upload their their video. And it felt a little bit like having to report on something in a foreign country because I was so limited behind my desk.
Right.
But it wasn't hard. I mean, and people were pretty willing to talk. People, once the rally was over or while they were streaming the rally, were happy to have a discussion. I mean, it's stuff that wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. And when it comes to the actual false stories, I just as a sideline, I enjoy kind of finding those. I sometimes will notice that something has picked up in one stream of social media or the other that is baseless or is a manipulated video that happened a couple days ago, where there's a video from the 80s of Biden joking with a black singer at an event, and somebody had manipulated the video to make it look like he was introducing a blackface singer. Didn't take a lot of time to find that, but I kind of just traced where it was coming from. And I wasn't in the mindset of creating a huge debunking. I just was looking at what was out there beyond and below the normal political conversation. It's not, that part is not that different than it would have been, I think, in a non-pandemic situation. I mean, you have in the Trump campaign, a campaign that is often running attacks on Democrats or on Joe Biden, that when you run them through the fact checker or you check the context of the quote, it's not totally accurate anyway. And this campaign in normal circumstances would have lots of Facebook ads that imply something that when we fact check it, it's false. I'm not sure if that's spreading faster than it would have without the pandemic. People are at home a bit more, but they also have more time. There also are more antibodies, whether they're effective or not, that are finding the pure fake stuff online.
Right.
Yeah, if I could just add something to what Dave said. It's not scientific, it's very, anecdotal, but I do almost feel like the fact that we are all home constantly, everyone, right, is lending to a much more online culture and is lending to people almost falling prey faster to conspiracy theories. And the that I've just been surprised by the number of friends, in other states who have texted me asking me to explain, the pandemic video or different conspiracy videos related to the virus. Is this accurate? Is it not accurate? And it's been insanely frustrating and a new development for me as a reporter. And so I am concerned that is only going to continue as we head towards the election for the reasons that Dave laid out, which is that already there was going to be rampant disinformation and misinformation, some coming from the Trump campaign itself.
A few weeks ago, Evan, we did a virtual focus group and we asked them to tell us like some of the craziest things that they had seen or heard about COVID-19 online. And I was shocked by the things that these people had seen, not only because I hadn't seen them, but just because people were putting this out there. Luckily, these voters recognized that it was all fake information, but it was things like, oh, if you snort a line of cocaine a day, you will protect yourself from getting COVID-19. If you wash your hands with vodka, you'll prevent getting COVID-19. And I was like, the fact that I am not even seeing this is a good thing, I guess, but bad that is even getting out there. Luckily, these folks knew. I mean, those are probably some of the more absurd examples, but to everyone else's point, when these things are rampant, they become more nuanced and like detailed. And I think that those things are harder for people to pick up on, especially as it relates to the coronavirus, because there's so much changing and happening that's real every day that kind of confuses people on top of the misinformation.
Alexi, I'm wondering if, again, I'm thinking back to this idea that in the absence of on-the-ground reporting where you're talking candidates or you're talking to voters, if it becomes easier for politicians to think that they can get away with saying things that are not true or putting out misinformation, and if it's harder off the campaign trail to do the kind of fact checking. I mean, I guess in some ways, as Laura said, this online culture, we're all sitting around, we're all Daniel Dale at this point, right? We're all spending all of our time just basically fact checking the president every single second or other candidates. But has this environment created a window for people to think they can get away with more since you're not constantly one or two steps from them on the trail?
Well, I don't know, I haven't seen a lot of misinformation from elected officials myself, but I will say that I think like the bad actors who exist online already, to your point, know that people are spending a lot more time online and know that things are moving very quickly. And so I think for that reason, it's a lot easier to sort of like pump the internet with all these different things. I will say though, on the other hand, of course, like there are so many voters who are just not online at all in the way that we're online. So they're not even hearing or seeing these things, but what they are hearing and seeing, I think kind of getting to your point, Evan, in a different way, is President Trump during those daily coronavirus briefings that now they're considering bringing back as a way to kind of resurrect.
We hear it's going to be back as of 5 o'clock today, right? The president said this morning, right?
Right, exactly. And so I think that's kind of an interesting change too. Like President Trump is doing this new style of delivering information to people that is not online at a time when most people are online. People are seeing that more, and he's throwing out any number of theories and ways to handle this, kind of to your point, in the way that we see bad actors doing online. So I think that that's kind of interesting to see what he's doing with those.
Katie Glueck, the thing about those coronavirus briefings was that in part they were the president putting out a narrative about the virus, and in part it was an opportunity for him to spar with the media, which he loves to do, and which ultimately helps him with his base. This is one of the things about this campaign that is different maybe from previous campaigns, is the degree to which more the media is blamed for everything. The media gets attacked for everything, right? How has that factored into the way you've thought about this your coverage, Katie?
Sure. I mean, for certainly any number of media, presidential election cycles, the media has always been, for some candidates in their view, a convenient political foil. So, I think that is something that we've seen for a long time, but no doubt that in this moment, in particular, the way that the president, the way that some politicians do talk about the media, talking about, enemy of the people, that kind of language, that is different from what we have seen in previous presidential campaigns, at least in a number of them going back several years. I think ultimately, looking at it from a reporter's perspective, all that we can do is really be doing our best to ensure that we are providing information that is as fair and as bulletproof and is as contextualized as possible. And certainly it's not just on the right that, where you see a lot of criticism of the media. Certainly there's lots of people on the left who have all kinds of concerns with how a particular story is covered. And so certainly it's a pretty fraught time, and a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons see reason to seize on the media as a foil, and so I think no doubt more scrutiny perhaps on what the media does than perhaps at any other time before. But that there's only so much that sort of we can control in terms of how we respond to that. So I think fairness and context and as much accuracy and kind of the fullest picture possible for in service, we hope, to the benefit and trust of the readers.
I appreciate, Katie, that you said it's not just coming from the right, but it's also coming from the left, that your organization, the New York Times, and that Dave's organization, the Washington Post, two very large establishment news organizations, it is often the left that believe not holding the president and Republicans as accountable as you ought to. It's as often that's the case as it is people attacking you from the right for being too liberal. Is it not?
Sure. I mean, there's, certainly, as we've discussed, the president, lots of his allies, on the right have long been critical of, the sort of mainstream news media. But certainly on the left, there's a lot of people who, there's this sort of debate, whether, I guess, the degree to which the media should be adversarial, toward the president or toward other elected officials. And certainly it's absolutely our job to, have that adversarial approach. But, at the same time that there's some debates, unfolding about to what extent, the media is considering a part of the opposition party, and sort of mainstream reporters play it straight, don't perhaps see ourselves in that role. So that leads to tensions, I think, on both sides.
Yeah. Dave, I'm thinking about last week when the president finally wore a mask, and Ashley Parker dared to tweet something that was, to the president saying, I'm going to say, I think he looks pretty good in that mask, or something to that effect. And she was slammed by people on the left for daring to say in that tweet that the president maybe looked okay in the mask and that maybe he shouldn't have waited so long to put one on. What a world we're living in terms of how you guys are viewed by both the left and the right.
I think there's been an it's very subjective. I think there has been an uptick in that, but I'd seen that attitude rising for years. I mean, there's an attitude among liberal readers of the news that the media was unfair to Hillary Clinton, that it tried to create an equivalence between, whatever she did wrong and whatever Trump did wrong in 2016. So you do get a lot of hair trigger responses like that. But in terms of just covering, I guess I think in terms of covering the campaign, the president does give you a bunch of stuff every week. It's usually very different. It might contradict something he said before or did before. And you saw it with the masks, where his members of his campaign team were tweeting not just that he looked good, but the election was effectively over, and he hasn't really been wearing one since then. Whereas the Biden campaign has been a lot more plotting and a lot more, I think, week to week on its messaging, and it has given you less to react to, at least from the candidate's own words, but it's been generally good for Biden. So when it comes to, I guess I phase out a lot of the criticism I'll see on Twitter if I think it's just kind of about the way a sentence is phrased, or disagreement with a tweet that doesn't agree with a page or paragraph 6 of an article. That's always going to be there. In terms of how to process the campaign itself, I mean, I think it's slowed everything down. It's been to the disadvantage of a candidate who can throw up a new story for a new news cycle every couple hours, if that. That might be saying it too slowly. I think what I paid more attention to is how much is he tossing out there versus how consistent is Biden doing it. And it involves paying a little bit less attention to Twitter critics, going back to what ads are they buying, what is the actual messaging they're throwing into these states beyond whatever people who are reading this think the message is.
Right. Hey, Laura, because you said that you're now back on the coronavirus campaign trail as much as the actual political campaign, ask you about one other aspect of this, how the media has been attacked. I've noticed in Texas that every time we at the Texas Tribune publish new data about coronavirus cases or hospitalizations, we're attacked simply for pushing a narrative that somehow by reporting the data that people say this is panic porn. You and the media are trying to politicize the coronavirus. Are you hearing that as you go out into communities of color and report on this stuff alongside the political stuff, that somehow the media is a bad actor for doing its job and reporting on the data?
I mean, I get the occasional Twitter troll who will say that by reporting on the disproportionate impact of the virus on Black people, on Latinos across the country, that somehow I am trying to divide the country and that I'm trying to divide voters and people by race and ethnicity. But the populations that are being impacted, who I talk to on a weekly basis now, whether it's Black people and health directors in Georgia, Latinos getting hit really hard in Arizona, Native American populations hit hard in Arizona or in California, they feel as though the story isn't out there enough, and that the media in trying to paint it as, oh, the virus shifted to red states, that somehow they aren't still being impacted, when we do know that across the board, they are brunt disproportionately of this disease. So I wouldn't say I pay attention to those critics. They definitely are sent my way. But I think it's our job, and as you guys at the Tribune are doing an excellent job in making sure that that data is out there, because across the board, the country and the federal government and states have, it's widely known that they have failed. I mean, epidemiologists I've spoken to have said that the data collection has failed, across the board. And we still are missing some 50% or more of data broken down by race or ethnicity in a number of states. And one thing an epidemiologist just said to me, and that's the last thing I'll say on this, is that this Harvard epidemiologist is actually very frustrated that we don't even have data by age adjustment for gender, which would show a lot more clearly the impact by gender, by sex on different age groups.
Right.
So again, there's just a lot of gaps across the board still.
Well, in fact, what we know about the incidence of the coronavirus by race, we know in part because Katie's newspaper, the New York Times, sued the CDC to get that data, right? It took suing the government to get that data. And now, of course, as we know, the data at the CDC is over to the Department of Health and Human Services, and it may even be harder for us to know what we need to know about that stuff. Alexi, let me bring you back into the conversation and ask you a kind of mundane, kind of down the center of the fairway question. What do you think the Trump strategy and what do you think the Biden strategy is as we sit here in July 2020? Given the circumstance, what do you think the strategy for the Kim. Oh, did I come back? You can hear me now? I'm
yeah,
sorry.
you're back now.
I was asking you kind of a mundane question. What do you think the Biden and the Trump strategies are now for prosecuting the balance of this campaign as we sit here in July 2020, given everything that's happened, given everything that's going on around us? Kind of shorthand, what do you think the strategies are for these two campaigns?
Well, the shorthand for President Trump, I mean, and I, full disclosure, do not cover him full time. I cover Biden full time. But what is clear in the last few weeks, months alone, is that he's reverting to really trying to capitalize on these culture wars. We know that he was a candidate in 2016 who thrived on stoking these culture wars and taking advantage of them. Now we're seeing how he's doing the same thing in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis. I mean, it's like the migrant caravan of 2018 midterm elections. Now he's doing everything he can to root for Confederate statues and monuments to maintain their place, not just in American history, but in the country in 2020 and beyond. And, you know, I think that's because he is really trying to play to that base of voters that he's always cared about. But what is clear now that we're seeing in polling, in focus groups, anecdotally, otherwise, is that he's losing support from critical voters, those who are 65 plus, in large part because of his handling of the coronavirus. Those are obviously the folks who are most affected, but they made up a quarter of the electorate in 2016, and they're really reliable voters, usually. Obviously, this year is different, so who knows who's reliable and who's not. He's also losing women. You know, earlier we were talking about not breaking down data by age, by gender. 65 plus women are really unhappy with Trump, even more so than 65 plus men. And there are a lot more 65 plus women than there are men just because of life mortality rates. So I think that we're seeing Trump really not trying to expand his electorate and hang on to that group of voters to get him across the finish line again. What we're seeing with Joe Biden is kind of completely the opposite. To my point earlier about how he's meeting voters where they are online, they're doing it in ways that, you know, sometimes seem kitschy or kind of, you know, whatever, like Instagram lives with high schoolers, for example, with different surrogates from their campaign, or Instagram lives with surrogates from their campaigns and celebrities from different TV shows. They're trying whatever they can, because the barrier to entry is so much lower since everything is online, to expand their electorate. And that's not just with different factions of Democratic voters, it's with Republican voters and independents too. I mean, today there's reporting out, and I have this confirmed, that John Kasich and other Republicans are being asked to speak at the Democratic convention on behalf of Joe Biden, which just speaks to our times. We've seen how different Republican groups are coming out in opposition to President Trump. It's one thing for Republicans to say, okay, I don't like Trump, I'm going to vote for a different Republican. It's a completely different thing for Republicans to leave Trump and move over to Biden's campaign. And it's really fascinating.
Actively speak at the convention, you know, put ad campaigns, whether it's the Lincoln Project or Republicans against Trump. We have a very different environment. Absolutely. Katie, Alexi talked to the politics of this. Let me ask you about the process of this. You know, you hear the Trump campaign complaining sometimes that Joe Biden is spending this entire election season in his basement. That's not literally true. But on the other hand, to the degree that Joe Biden hasn't been out and as visible as he might be under a normal circumstance, it hasn't seemed to really hurt him, Katie.
No, not at all. And you know, we'll see what the pace looks like headed into the fall.
Do we have Katie Glueck?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep.
Great. So yes, you're absolutely right. It has not hurt him at all, and would love to echo Alexi in terms of where we're seeing some of the voter shift, especially with that 65 plus, those senior voters, typically much more conservative, and the fact that those voters are in play for Joe Biden this time around is really significant, and I think underscores the challenge that President Trump faces headed into this. But you know, certainly as much as the Trump campaign, says that Joe Biden is stuck in his basement. You're right. It's not literally true. Sometimes, you know, he is kind of getting out there about once a week doing, these very careful events, typically giving a speech on policy, certainly, you know, I've heard from Democrats for a long time who would like to see him out there more, who's, you know, do get, this is abated some given where the polls are, but, you know, certainly at the beginning of the summer and in late spring, we're quite anxious about the extent to which Biden was being overshadowed by Trump. Now, you know, in even talking with Democrats, you hear a lot of people who are of the mind that in their view, Trump is causing a lot of destruction to himself, and so don't get in the way of that. And then there's others who say that, Biden ultimately is going to need to be out there in a more active way. And it's my understanding, from people around him that certainly they would like to do that and are looking at the best ways to do that. But, in the meantime, absolutely, they're trying to connect online, as Alexi said. I think that we may well see a tale of two ground games. It's very interesting. In 2016, Donald Trump had no ground game, and it didn't matter for him. And this time around, he's kind of the organized one, with the field offices in place, and we'll see whether Biden tries to match that at some point, or if they turn their focus entirely online and try not to get in the way when to the extent to which Trump's causing damage to himself.
Dave Weigel, as we look ahead for the next couple of months, we actually don't know what the next couple of months are going to be. I mean, let's say the not so quiet part out loud, that the uncertainty about the world means that these campaigns are really having to plan their strategy from week to week. The Biden campaign doesn't know any more than we do whether they're going to be able to do something like a game at any point between now and November. What we're seeing now, this online strategy, Dave, this may be it for both the Trump and the Biden campaigns for the balance of the cycle, right?
Yeah, and I guess I'd separate into three buckets. One of them is, will he do rallies? Biden's already suggested he might not have a traditional rally for the rest of the campaign. I mean, we've gone more than half the period between him clinching the nomination and the election. We've gone without him having a rally. He might not have one, and frankly, based on the results of the primaries, they revealed that most voters don't go to rallies. I mean, Bernie Sanders got bigger crowds. Bernie Sanders got destroyed once it became a two-man race. Right. So as that for an issue for Biden, they're missing out on some data, but they're not going to run they were never going to run the kind of campaign that Sanders was, which depended on contacting as many new voters as possible in person, knocking on as many doors as possible, et cetera. So the other two things are something that happened kind of quietly at the very start of the pandemic was states changing their laws to allow more absentee voting. Something's happening technically quietly, but with a lot of money behind it, are the lawsuits. It's worth watching that, and it's not a thing normally we've had to watch very closely for what kind of electorate there will be. There are going to be some states where they're telling people you have to do this, this, and this to fill out your absentee ballot. There are some where they're going to tell them absentee ballot's coming your way, just fill it in this way. If you look at what happened in New York, I'll mention again, a lot of people thought they voted and they screwed it up because they hadn't cast absentee ballots before. And that's the third part of this. I mean, beyond suing and passing laws so that the electorate can turn out in untraditional ways, that's what I think the GOTV is going to be based on in large part. And there's an asymmetry because the Trump campaign has said that it's put people back out there knocking on doors in traditional style of campaigning, and Democrats have not. The caveat, and the Wisconsin election was a little bit weird this year because the Democratic primary is the same day as the race for a judicial slot, but Democrats didn't do traditional door-to-door targeting. They did tons and tons of phone calls telling people how to turn in absentee ballots, and they did very well in that election. That's not a preview of everything that's going to come, but what they already kind of demoed what would it look like if people are not allowed to vote, or I guess if they're scared to show up and vote. And the answer for them in that election was you can manage. So I think that's the GOTV we have to look for, which is not something we've ever looked at. In some ways, that'll be good. I mean, there's a lot of door-to-door canvassing field can be a little bit Potemkin. You can go out with a campaign, see them knock on 20 doors, they get a couple yeses, and that didn't tell you a whole lot about what's actually happening. So finding what is actually happening is going to be tricky, but involves keeping all those things in perspective. Like, this is not going to be a campaign that's going to have a big Biden rally and that means you got 10,000 new voters. That's not how it's going to work.
Yeah, this is definitely very, very different. Laura, back to your wearing your Biden hat right now. Alexi said, well, the president wants to run the old playbook in terms of the culture war. He also wants to run the old playbook in terms of defining his opponent with nicknames and in ways that are much more familiar to 2016. We've had corrupt Biden, we've had Beijing Biden, we've had Sleepy Joe. None of that stuff seems to be sticking. None of that stuff seems to be working this time. That is one big difference in terms of this campaign versus last. The strategy that worked in 2016 doesn't seem, at least to this point, to be working now.
Right. I think what this speaks to is the what happened in 2016, which was that Bernie Sanders also was misguided in thinking that the vote that he got in 2016 was pro-Bernie as opposed to potentially anti-Clinton. And so I think Trump was able to very much define Clinton because of the animosity that was held towards her by a number of people across the electorate. And that helped do the work for him, as opposed to Biden, who is much harder to define. There isn't as much just natural anger or hostility towards Biden as there was towards Clinton. And so all of those attempts to define him so far, whether, like you said, it's to China or just defining him as sleepy and like not cognitively there
right,
or able to be the president, isn't working. We saw this past weekend, his exchange on Fox News with Chris Wallace. If anything, it potentially hurt Trump to get into this back and forth about, I took a cognitive test and the doctor said that I passed with flying colors, and Biden would not be able to pass that. Again and again, all of these attempts by his campaign to attack Biden, to attack his children. We've seen the RNC Rapid Response tweet out and then get lambasted for including tweets that have Biden's kids when they were very little, and using those to attack him. All of those attempts haven't stuck. And if anything, it maybe is helping Biden. Some recent polling just this past week from Monmouth had Biden up by double digits in Pennsylvania. So polling has consistently over the last few months has just shown Biden rising and rising, even in battleground states against Trump.
Katie, Laura's mention of the polls makes me want to ask you, about all this talk that, well, the polls were wrong in 2016. That's, the line that you'll hear, whether that's actually the case or not. Well, the polls were wrong in 2016. So even though the polls say what they say right now, don't believe it. There's still plenty of time. These are all fake polls. Maybe 2020 is just different from 2016. Maybe the idea of somehow trying to look at this campaign through the lens of the last campaign is a problem for those who are doing it. Not Clinton. This election cycle is not that election cycle. You can't really use that as a frame of reference. What do you think about that?
Sure. There are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who seem almost stuck in the 2016 framework and are viewing so much of the election through the lens of what happened that year. And no doubt that Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton are two very different candidates. And it's also clear that people who headed into the 2016 election not entirely sure whether Trump would govern in the same way that he campaigned, they now have the answer to that. And whether they like what they see or don't like what they see is something that there still are 3 months left. I think fair to say that still remains to be seen. But to build on something that Laura was saying, Trump in the last couple of weeks in particular has taken such a scattershot approach to Biden. We just did a story on this last week that in the Philadelphia media market, for example, his campaign is, at least as of last week, is running both ads that paint him as too tough on crime and ads that paint him as too soft on crime, which really underscore their challenge in deciding how it is that they want to define him. But at the same time, there are a lot of Democrats who are aware that Trump, at least in 2016, and maybe it's right to use that mindset and maybe it isn't, but that at least then he was very successful in ultimately defining Hillary Clinton in their view. And so, there's a lot of Democrats out there who are worried about that. They are in constant talks with the Biden campaign. Some of Biden's top advisors have set up these phone calls with key congressional delegations in battleground states, conversations that can sort of serve as an early warning system if any of these attacks are breaking through in a way that some of these Democratic members feel is problematic. So, they say that they're taking it very seriously, even though it does look like, at least as of now, Trump's struggling to define him.
Evan, I'll say,
yes, please. Go ahead, Alexi,
your point on 2016 being different from 2020. I mean, it's not just, I think that Biden is so different from Hillary Clinton, and I think that can be explored literally every day until the election to remind people of that. But I think what's also interesting is that in 2016, it was Trump versus Hillary Clinton. In 2020, it's Trump versus himself. Yes, he's running against Joe Biden, and I think the Biden campaign is trying to figure out how much of a referendum on Trump this election will actually be to voters. But I think all signs are pointing to it being exactly that, which of course is what history has shown us too. I mean, we saw sort of the backlash against President Trump in the 2018 midterms, which benefited Democrats greatly, obviously in the House, but in other down ballot local elections too. And I think that's what's really difficult for Trump. He's trying to define Biden. That's not working. But what's also not working, or what's a lot harder for Trump, is running against himself. It's a lot easier for him to run against an opponent who he has turned into a complete caricature. He can't do that with Biden. And not only can he not do that, but he's now stuck clearly running against himself and his policy record, which he of course didn't have when he was running in 2016.
And Dave Weigel, you know, I think Alexi's point is exactly right. You know who else is running against Trump? All the Republican Senate candidates in the swing states, right? I mean, just as the president, this is really a referendum on the president, those Senate races are also a referendum on the president. The Arizona race, the Colorado race, the Montana race, the Maine race, the North Carolina race, the Georgia, South Carolina race, places we were going to be talking about in July 20. Those are all effectively referendums on the president as well, aren't they, Dave Weigel?
Oh, yeah, they're more vulnerable because of the president's unpopularity, which comes from both the pandemic and I think the response to the George Floyd protests. And we saw in 2016, it is very hard when he's on the ballot to distance yourself from him. The politics of today are not like the politics of 1996, where you could run as a Republican and say, well, Bob Dole's going to lose, and here's my agenda. You can't have a break with Trump. He ends up alienating some of your voters.
And Dave, he won't let them break from him. That's the other part, right? He won't allow it.
Yeah, that too. But the other aspect of this that's really telling about what happened in this campaign, very few, the last I counted, less than 6 ads have been run by Republicans running for anything, for House or for Senate, that attack Joe Biden. The only exceptions have been if they kind of fold him into an attack for making on a Democrat about China or something like that. They tend to attack Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, and Nancy Pelosi, who will be Speaker if they win the House again. But he has not been a easy subject to attack. And he's not, the other thing that I think gets left out of kind of the Trump world narrative of 2016 is they admitted at the time they got very lucky because, we're mid-July. This is when James Comey 4 years ago issued his report on Hillary Clinton, said he wasn't going to charge her, but that drove her numbers down. In October, WikiLeaks had emails released every day that hurt Hillary Clinton. Comey emerged at the end of the election. So there are a lot of weeks where now Biden is able to have an event and the story is Biden unveils plan. The story for Hillary for the same event would have been facing questions on emails. Clinton tries to pivot to plan. And that dynamic is just, it's there, so we're not noticing it every single day. I think that's been very important, especially in Trump's inability to read Biden and make him scary for people. It's not just his record. It's not just all the other things we could go into. It's not just gender. It's that just even when they bring up something like Hunter Biden's business record or Ukraine or anything like that, it has not connected in the same way. That really has mattered and something Trump can control.
Yeah.
Evan, did you cut out? Am I the only one that he cut out for?
I didn't hear all of it, no.
Yeah, I didn't hear either.
We've lost Evan again. Okay. You're muted, Evan.
Oh, I'm back. I apologize. So the question was, will the vice presidential choice matter? Yes or no? Each of you very quickly. Laura, Dave, Katie, Alexi. Will it matter to come to the election?
No, I don't think so.
Dave, will it matter?
I think it will, because we'll see if Trump's able to make the VP nominee scary to people, which he hasn't been able to do with Biden.
Biden. Katie, will the vice president matter?
I think
Vice president.
I think it'll be a campaign issue. How significant it is, I'm not willing to commit yet, but we'll be talking about it.
Alexi?
Yes, to Dave's point. Yes.
It will matter, to Dave's point, right?
Yeah, I think Dave's point is right. Yep.
Right. Okay, and then the second question is, will we have a winner on election night? Alexi? Will we know who the president is? Or the president's going to be on election?
On election night, no.
Katie?
Gosh, I don't know. It depends so much on what happens with all the different methods of voting and modes of voting and how much is absentees. I don't know.
Yeah, Dave.
I think we'll know who's winning. I mean, I can imagine a situation where Pennsylvania's counted everything but Philly and it's tied. Then we'll know Biden won Pennsylvania, for example. I think we'll have trends that tell us where it's going election night.
Right. Laura, this is the nightmare for all of us who care about this stuff. We're going to go through election night, go to bed and not know who's going to win. What do you think?
I think that, like Dave said, we will have some idea of where it's headed. Although I don't expect that we'll have all the votes tallied by any means whatsoever.
So we'll know where it's trending, but we won't have a conclusive answer, you think?
Right.
Right. Okay. So let's now go to audience questions. We've had a bunch while we've been talking today. Let me go ahead and try to get in as many as we can between now and the next 15 or 18 minutes or so. Here is a question from Leon. Asks, as far as of coverage of elections in other countries, in this case of the 2020 US election, what would you say are the main issues that foreign journalists must cover or must pay attention to? Laura Barrón-López, let me start with you. What are the main issues that foreign journalists who are trying to cover this election should be following in this campaign?
Well, I think we lightly touched on it, but disinformation and misinformation is one of the biggest things that I think needs to be covered. Potential influence, continued influence from Russia or potentially other foreign actors is something. Biden just said that he started getting intel briefings again, and that he's very concerned about interference from Russia.
Right. Dave Weigel, are we going to be talking about things significantly over the next couple of months, or are we going to forget that ever happened?
I missed what the audio cut out exactly at the noun you used. Are we going to
be talking about Russia?
Oh,
over the next 4 months, or are we going to forget that ever happened in the last campaign?
So it's a somewhat complicated answer. Casting no aspersions whatsoever on the people who reported the Russia controversy meddling in the 2016 election. Not saying that all that reporting was legitimate, all the stories legitimate, but I think until impeachment, that was a story that a lot of liberals paid very close attention to because they thought maybe there was kind of a lever we're going to find that you pull it and Trump disappears. I think that's flipped, and you now have some Republicans waiting for the indictments or the investigation or the announcement that's going to knock Biden out or knock him down. The craziest manifestation of that being the QAnon stuff. That there's going to be something. There's going to be something at some point. So I think in the sense of the campaign narrative, a little bit, but probably on the sidelines. In sense of meddling with the election, that is a constant story, and it's depressing to think about. But the issue is so hardened and partisan at this point that a big chunk of the country is just not going to believe it if told in either direction that there's been meddling that's influenced the vote. I think an election could have a very definitive result. Let's say it looks like it does in the polling today. There would still be a very large number of people who say there must have been some foreign interference. There must have been millions of illegal votes. So we'll hear about it. I think if you're a foreign journalist looking at it, sticking to facts, seeing what is being done from state to state to guard against this, that's the way to go at it. But look, in the 2016 campaign, Hillary Clinton dealt with this. There plenty of evidence, intelligence organizations saying that, and agencies, I should say, saying that this was a foreign hack with intent of helping Donald Trump, hurting Hillary Clinton. And a lot of people who are not just in the Trump side, but on the left saying, what a crazy excuse. That's a conspiracy theory. There has to be something else. So any premise that is, can we get 100% of Americans to believe the objective facts that we've reported, that's going to fall apart. No, we're never going to get most people believing in the facts of a case.
Okay, let me go ahead to another question here. Alexi, let me direct this one to you. This is a communications PhD candidate writing from Finland who notes that his country has a 34-year-old prime minister, Sanna Marin, and that he says, we love her. What is your expert opinion on why younger U.S. presidential candidates cannot compete with the seniors, two oldest candidates running for president we've ever had in history, right? In the same major party candidates. What happened to the younger candidates in this race?
I mean, that is one of the more fascinating trends of this primary cycle. Even just thinking about how we in the media covered the diversity of the Democratic primary field. There were so many women, people of color, to your point and the questioner's point, younger people who, you know, obviously Mayor Pete was somebody who surprised a lot of people in large part because of his age, but also because of his relative experience, you know, to wanting to run for the White House. But I think that Donald Trump has changed a lot of things for a lot of people, and polling throughout the primary, in spite of like the shiny objects that we all kind of chased at different points, polling throughout the primary showed that Democratic primary voters prioritized a candidate's ability to beat President Trump in November more than anything else. And that stayed consistent throughout the primary and polling, but also stayed consistent. What also stayed consistent was Biden's relatively high approval rating, even when he had gaffes or moments on the debate stage when he was being criticized by his opponents, he still remained relatively steady, where others would have a bump and then go back to where they were, or they would just go down and down until they eventually dropped out. I think that a lot of voters throughout this primary, ones I talked to especially, said that they wanted a sense of stability. They wanted to move past the chaos that they felt was kind of swirling around President Trump and his administration. And Biden looked like a safe space for them to kind of, you know, find a political home in the President Trump era. And that, you know, was something that we saw hold consistent throughout the primary. I think that's why. I think that maybe in a different year, in a different lifetime, if Trump wasn't elected, or if we were past Trump for many years, then maybe people would feel differently. But when they're thinking about how to move past this moment, they found that, you know, a septuagenarian like Joe Biden was really what made them feel comfortable and stable and able to move past Trump and Trumpism.
You know, Katie, Glueck, thinking back to 2018, it's not just age. The three constituencies that were so significant in Texas and in other places and Democrats having a better cycle were young people, women, and people of color. You had some younger people in this race. You had women in this race. You had people of color in this race. And instead we got an old white guy as the Democratic nominee. What happened? I mean, it's kind of amazing to think about it.
You know, ultimately, for a lot of voters in the Democratic primary, ultimately, this time around, representation was not the number one issue. You know, Joe Biden, I think it's fair to say, became the Democratic nominee in enormous part due to really strong support from older African-American voters who, you know, with whom he had a very strong connection for a wide variety of reasons that we covered pretty extensively. But, you know, ultimately, bigger picture, and there's a lot of reasons that go into this, but, you know, as, you know, in part, I think Alexi was saying, for a lot of Democratic primary voters this time around, the overriding question was, who do we think can beat Donald Trump? And for a whole lot of reasons, you know, they saw Joe Biden as the stable choice, that, you know, the choice that, as we were talking about earlier, you know, that perhaps would be difficult to make him as scary as, you know, to more moderate voters. So a lot of voters looked at it that way. And then, you know, there's all kinds of other dynamics. I mean, the more progressive vote was certainly fractured for a while, but, you know, ultimately and, you know, we should note, of course, that Biden did terribly in the Iowa caucuses and he did terribly in the New Hampshire primary. But ultimately, when he came out of South Carolina and headed into Super Tuesday with some more momentum, there were so many voters who were comfortable enough with him and so ready to move into the general election that we saw people get on board in really big numbers. They just wanted to end the primary and start taking the fight to Trump.
Laura, you know, Matthew Dowd, who was famously an apostate strategist for George W. Bush during the Bush campaigns, he ran for a while some of the Bush efforts, and then he sort of broke with Bush. He said a couple of years ago, heading into this campaign cycle, that the Democrats' slogan should be "Make America Boring Again." Maybe in the end, the most important thing for the Democrats in this race was not age, it was not gender, it was not race, but it was somehow completely turning the page from the chaos presidency. Maybe the simplest explanation is the correct explanation.
Yeah, I mean, the press got hit a bit for talking a lot about electability, but that was also because voters were talking about concerns about electability and talking about fear that if anyone who was a really big target for Trump would mean that Democrats lost the election. And so these primary voters were very worried. You know, when I was in South Carolina talking to older Black voters, they were effusive. A number of them, I was surprised, were effusive in their praise for Warren. They liked her policies. But at the end of the day, they said, look, I'm going to vote for Biden because because she's a woman and look at what happened to Clinton, or because her policies just aren't going to fly. Congress is not going to work with her. And Nancy Pelosi, I think Congress, yes, there's also a lot of septuagenarians in Congress who have the mantle, and I think their influence in terms of also influencing the Democratic primary voter by saying, look, I'm not gonna be willing to pass Medicare for all, or I'm not gonna be willing to bring that to the floor, could have also had some influence in some of these voters when they were heading to the polls and deciding who ultimately could work with Congress, could get things done to reverse what Trump did and get elected.
Okay, Dave Weigel, let me ask you a question. Jay Rosen, who is often at this conference in person, the NYU professor, has asked a question to us online here. And I'm going to direct it to you, although obviously I think it could be directed to anybody here. What are you trying to accomplish with your campaign coverage during the cycle?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I approach everything as what does this country think and what does it want, which it's hard to answer until people are running around and ask me to become president. And I think, to be honest, some of the story I'm telling is a little more inside baseball, a little more scorecard, who's winning various races. But each of those races has been telling us about what people are accepting, what they're interested in at the moment. I mean, in New York, we saw a number of candidates become the first Black member of Congress from a district that had never elected anyone but white candidates. We've seen just the Republicans in recruiting down ballot candidates try to change what they're, if not what they're running on, at least who they're running. So I think capturing a lot of the currents going on in the country through the campaign. And there are weeks or days when the campaign's not the most important story. Many days it's not the most important story. I don't think the campaign scanned exactly with the protests that were happening. But I think generally that's the story I'm trying to tell. But I keep in mind that not everything influences the campaign. I think that's been a problem for Republicans, is some days they're kind of trying to make the story about some cultural war or some TV show, and not everything runs through the stream of the campaign, but voter opinion, American opinion. And for example, people who 10 years ago would have said there isn't systemic racism, saying now there is. I think covering the campaign and looking for evidence of that is something I've been trying to do.
Katie, is your job to tell people what happened or to tell people what's important in this campaign?
I think big picture, I would say the job is to help people to sort of explain what is happening to voters and to help, even more importantly, understand why it's happening. And so, for me at least, I think we are at just such an extraordinary moment in this country and in our history and in our political history. And I, want to do the best job possible to understand what is motivating voters in this country, and understand what's motivating and driving the two main candidates in this race and who they are, and do my best to sort of shed some light on the character at play.
Laura, here's a question that relates to the visit of President López Obrador to the White House earlier this month. Questioner Cesar is noting that the visit of the Mexican president did not have much of an impact on the U.S. media. But in Mexico, the meeting was interpreted as Trump's attempt, or an attempt, one of probably a couple, to revive his campaign and get some support from Mexican Americans. Do you think this visit had or will have any impact on the campaign? And generally speaking, do you think that we're thinking beyond our borders in this cycle? If the Polish president or the Mexican president or anything else that materializes on the president's schedule happens between now and November, is there the potential for any of that stuff to affect the outcome of this race?
I'm skeptical of it impacting this race. I do not think that the Mexican president's visit to the White House influenced Latino or Mexican American voters that much in any which way.
Well, it barely registered for any voters, it seems like, right? We've almost forgotten the fact that he was even here, right? It was just a couple of days ago.
Right, and I think part of that is because, look, coronavirus is running rampant in this country right now. Almost all states are in the red zone, and the president has tried to hold other events, has tried to direct the public's view towards something else. He tried to do that with Tulsa, and he tried to do that in New Hampshire, and then they thought that they realized that maybe they weren't going to get the crowd size that they had expected, and then canceled it due to weather, even though it ended up being clear skies. So realizing that they aren't able to just recreate reality and focus on a very different topics that the president wants to focus on.
In a normal campaign, foreign policy or visits by foreign leaders might actually have a role in the campaign, but at the moment, it's basically all coronavirus all the time, right? No matter what else you try to talk about.
Things happening domestically that I'm not sure the average voter is going to be paying attention to presidents, meetings with foreign presidents. Typically, it might. I think Biden early on definitely wanted to make this an aspect of his campaign. He hit over and over again that he was the only candidate in the Democratic primary who could on day one rebuild those relationships with foreign allies. So that he's wanted to, we may hear more of that from him. But again, the topics on the minds of the American electorate aren't really focused on relationships with allies. It's focused on what's happening with their paycheck, what's happening with their healthcare, coronavirus, and now the massive unrest around police violence against African Americans across the country.
Right. All right, we've got about 2 minutes left. Let me ask a question to you, Alexi, and then the last question is a great Weigel-y kind of question for Dave as we head out. So let's let Alexi, what's going to happen on election night or not long after if the president loses, but he is unwilling to accept defeat? What happened? We had a little bit of a sense of that actually over the weekend in the interview with Chris Wallace, did we not? Where the president would not, we're certain that he would accept the outcome of the election. So what happens then?
Yeah, right. I mean, he said to Chris Wallace, we will see. That's the Trump line. Right, it's coming in 2 weeks, or we will see what happens. I mean, to be fair, I think he's right. We will see what happens. Obviously, the work's out in his favor. He's going to be happy and not question the results of the election. I think to Weigel's point earlier, I think it was Weigel, someone was saying that Russian interference could really change the election either way. So it's really curious how both Biden and Trump will talk about the results. But I mean, that's the thing. Trump was asked if he's a gracious loser, and he even said, we will see. We know, though, that President Trump loves winning. He's not going to go out quietly. He doesn't let people leave his administration or his White House quietly because he's consistently thinking about settling personal scores. If we know anything to be true about President Trump and his pattern of behavior, it's that he wants to settle personal scores, and this is the biggest personal score that he would have to settle of his lifetime. Of course, if he loses, there's just no chance that he goes out quietly. He's not a quiet person. Whether or not that means he challenges the integrity of the results, we will see. It really remains to be seen.
Right now, we will see, right? I mean, can you hear me?
It's being cut out. I couldn't hear the last thing.
No, Dave, can you hear me now? Okay, here's the last question for you, Dave. Okay, what about Kanye?
Why is that the question for me? So it's a moving target. How to sum it up? So to start with, I think because Trump won, there is an attitude out there that I find a little lazy, which is that means people want famous people to be president now. I don't think that's true at all. Donald Trump was one of the most famous, wealthy people in the world for about 2 decades, almost 3 before he got The Apprentice. So his image was of a successful businessman who then had a TV show, not the other way around. Kanye West's image is of a very eccentric celebrity. He has not done the work so far to get on ballots in states where it takes some elbow grease to get on them. In Texas, for example, he will not be on the ballot. In Michigan, he's not going to be on. He had a rally in South Carolina that didn't have much of a message beyond relitigating Harriet Tubman's record, and it did not help him get on the ballot there. So we've got a couple weeks where he might try to get on some ballots, but I wonder if there's been an overrating of how much people want a distraction like that. I don't think Joe Biden would be up by 8 to 12 points if people wanted flash. They're worried about a government not responding to a crisis competently. And the Kanye West brand is more about fun shoes, eccentricity, weird music videos. People are finding some resistance if they say this means this guy should be president. Which
Hey, Dave, you're giving a serious answer to a question about Kanye, a thoughtful, long, serious answer. I thought it would be an opportunity for a one-liner on the way out here, but it actually ended up being a long.
In the spirit of Kanye, I'm never going to stop talking. You have to cut me off.
Okay, good. Well, you guys, we have to stop right there. I want to thank so much Laura Barrón-López, Katie Glueck, Alexi McCammond, Weigel for their time and their patience over the last 75 minutes. It was so great to be with all of you. Thank you, Rosendahl, for having us. I'm now going to hand it back over to Mallory for some housekeeping on the way out the door.
Great. Thank you so much to each of you for sharing your insights with us. I certainly learned a lot, and I loved hearing your firsthand experiences of what it's been like on the campaign trail, especially in the midst of the pandemic and all of the challenges that that presents, including rampant misinformation and disinformation. So thank you again, Evan, Laura, Katie, Alexi, and David for being with us. To everyone else joining us today, thank you once again for attending the first ever fully online ISOJ. I'd like to remind you that our next and last panel of the day will be about how to reinvent sustainable models to make local journalism survive and thrive in the digital age. It starts at 4 p.m. Central, and you don't want to miss it. We will also be continuing the ISOJ festivities this evening with our happy hour at 5:30 p.m. Central. And you can visit isoj.org to register. Once you do, you will receive instructions via email about how to access the happy hour. So thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you back here very soon as ISOJ 2020 continues.